The last stage of the process is to work out whether the tides are currently springs or neaps, and therefore whether we should use the spring rate or the neap rate, or in fact whether we should use somewhere in between. To do this, we need to look back at the standard port tide table. You'll remember from earlier that we found the tidal range for the period of time we are travelling. With a high water time of 4:30 and a low water time of 10:13 in the morning, we looked at the heights at these times. So the 4.4 and the 2.2 gave us a range, a difference between those two numbers, of 2.2 metres, which we wrote up here earlier. Now, moving a couple of pages forward in the tide table brings us to the tidal curve page for Victoria. Now, we don't need the tidal curve. What we need is this information in this corner here. We need to know the spring mean range and the neap mean range. So we write those on this table here. So springs are going to be 4.9. So if the range is 4.9, we know that that's the sort of average spring range. And if it's 2.4 metres, we know that that's the neap mean range. So looking at this information here, we can see that our 2.2 metres is very close to the neap range, and therefore in this case we would use the neap rate and we would use this number here. So on this particular day, 3 hours before high water, we would use this direction and this speed to do our next step, which would either be a course to steer or an estimated position. Here you can see we've got a slightly different example. We've done this on a different day, this time on the 13th of February. High water on this particular day was 11:07 in the morning, and the high water height was 5.6. We're looking at between 12:37 and 13:37 in the afternoon, so we're looking at the low water height after that, which was 1 metre. So the difference between those two, the range on this particular occasion, was 4.6 metres, which we write on the table here. You can also see on this table we've pre-printed it with the same information as before. Again, for Victoria, a spring range of 4.9 and a neap range of 2.4. We've pre-filled in the data from the tidal diamond that we need, and we simply need to work out what the actual rate we're going to use today is. Now, if you compare today's range, 4.6, against these two numbers, you can see that 4.6 is very close to the spring range, so we're going to use the spring rate in this case. So we're going to use the 3.4. So when we come to doing our course to steer or estimated position, we're going to use a direction of 1 to 8 degrees true and 3.4 knots in this case. In this third example, we're going to assume that it's now the 10th of February. High water time is at 9:24 in the morning. We can see that we are travelling very early in the morning, between about 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the morning, and the range is 3.7. We've worked that out by taking away the high water, the low water height from the high water height. Now, as you can see, this 3.7 is somewhere between 2.4 and 4.9. And in fact, if we were to work out where the halfway point between these numbers was, these two ranges, we would add the two together and divide them by 2, and we could see that the midpoint was 3.65 metres. And as you can see, 3.65 is very close to 3.7. Now, as this range for today is very close to the midpoint, we'll take the midpoint of these two rates. Now, the midpoint between these two rates will be calculated in exactly the same way by adding the two together and dividing by 2. That gives us a figure of 1.35, or to the nearest one decimal place, 3.4 knots. And in this case, that's the speed we're going to use. That's the rate we're going to use. So in this particular example, we'd use 182 degrees true and 1.4 knots of tide. And now you can see that we've run through all three possibilities for Dayskipper. We're looking for you to identify whether the range on the particular day you're interested in is closest to the neap range, in which case you use the neap rate, is closest to the spring range, in which case you use the spring rate, or it's closest to the midpoint, in which case you go halfway between.